In this video we're going to be doing a coolant flush on this 1975 280 SL, and this is just some of the gunk that came out when we did that. Hopefully your car won't be as bad as this one, which was sitting for 10 years before we started work on it, but it's definitely worth doing a thorough coolant flush on your car if you haven't done one before. At the same time as doing the coolant flush, we'll be fitting this auxiliary air valve, which we refurbished in a previous video, and that entails draining the coolant in this car. Just to recap for anybody who's not aware of this bulb here is in contact with the coolant of the engine, and as the engine warms up and the coolant warms up, a little piston inside here moves up and effectively seals this airflow off here. So when the engine is warm, this part should play absolutely no part in the running of the engine, and there should be no air getting to the engine through this valve here. What happens when people buy a new car, or they haven't used their car for a long time, when the idle speed is too high, rather than actually fixing this unit here, what people do is start adjusting that screw down there, which is the idle mixture screw. So invariably when you take this off and change it with one that actually works, you will find that you actually have to adjust that screw there to bring things back to how they should have been. Now, if you don't want to refurbish your own auxiliary air valve, there is a guy based in Holland called Sten Classics that will do the job for you. They will bead blast the outside of this, put a new thermostatic bulb in, replace this or remanufacture that if need be, and I will leave a link to his service on the screen below. If you want to refurbish your own auxiliary air valve, there is a guy called Jag Improver, sells on eBay the actual insert and the bulb, so you can just press out your insert and knackered bulb and press the whole thing back in. He makes his own little inserts, which is quite a nifty design, so you could also potentially go along to Marley or Mercedes, buy a bulb and an insert and put the thing together yourself and save a few pounds. So once again, I'll leave the link to his service on the screen below. Just to remind viewers who may not be following this channel, this car was sitting for 10 years before we ever looked at it, so I've no doubt at all that there's a whole bunch of rusty sludge in the engine block. So before we remove the auxiliary air valve, we'll take the opportunity to flush the coolant several times. We'll change the auxiliary air valve and then we'll do it one last time. Drained all the coolant out of this car, and I'm going to put 1 litre of Thermocure in here. This is a product made by Evaporust, and it will bond to the rust, and we will drive the car around for a few days, get the coolant hot and cold and hot and cold, do that for several days, and then we'll give it 2 more flushes with water, and then we'll fill the car up with coolant and see how we go from there. We've gone for our first drive since adding the Thermocure to the cooling system. You can see that coolant is now black, so we're going to drive around for the next few days, and hopefully all the rust will actually bond with the Thermocure, so when you wash the Thermocure out, it'll actually have bonded with all the rust in the system, and then we'll flush the system 2 more times with water, and then we'll put coolant in. We've been driving around for several days with the Thermocure in the system. The level of the coolant has actually dropped quite a lot. Now I'm hoping that's simply because the air bubbles have come out and been replaced by coolant, and not that we've got some cracked head and the coolant is evaporating through the engine. Let's hope that's not the case. I have gone on to Asda and bought one of these big things here, because last time we tried draining the coolant from the lower hose, we ended up covering the garage floor with coolant. So hopefully that will slightly reduce that. We've undone that lower hose, and boy does that water come out with some force. Once again we've managed to spill coolant everywhere, but not as much as last time. Now I'm just filling the car up with just tap water. We're going to do that twice, drive it around the block, get the tap water just to circulate, take out what's left of the Thermocure mix. Just the actual weight of the water is causing that to drain down into the engine. We've put 8 litres in there, and I think this takes 10 to 11 metres from memory. When I take this pipe off, it will come splashing out, and obviously that water is boiling hot, so you've got to make sure you've got gloves on when you do this. Wow, this coolant or water is still pretty dirty. It's not as bad as it was, but I suspect that we may yet have to do a few more flushes of this system before we get crystal clear water coming out. We've flushed the coolant system several times. Now it's time to remove the auxiliary air valve. Now the moment of truth. Let's see what this auxiliary air valve looks like. Wow. Look at this. This is split here. So what that basically means is you would have air coming in there when you shouldn't. Now, to the best of my knowledge, these should never have a rubber gasket on, and if you lift that gasket up, you can see that underneath this is completely knackered. In situations like this, you would have no choice but to go to someone either like Sten Classics or Jag Lovers and replace all of this. Just before we move on from this here, it is worth mentioning, can you see how that there sits up a millimeter and is not flush? Now that is important because as you press this down, it closes the air gap in there, and that's the amount of air that the car gets when the engine is cold. So if you make the mistake of pushing that down flush, which I believe I did with the refurbished one, what will happen is you will get less air than you should when the car is cold, and obviously that means that the car will rev lower when it's cold than it should. We'll see the effects of that probably when we fit the refurbished air slide valve. Here is just a small sample of some of the sludge that came out of this engine. Isn't that crazy? Bearing in mind we've flushed this coolant out 3 times before we took the auxiliary air valve out. So I suppose a point to note, if you are doing a coolant flush, maybe doing it through the auxiliary air valve hole is a better way of doing it. It's the next day and we've been along to Mercedes to get some more of these rubber L bends here. This one is split, and the others, to be perfectly honest, have been on the car probably for 40 years and are cracking. So these are not particularly expensive, and in fact the cheapest place to get them is Mercedes. And as I've mentioned many times before you go onto eBay or any of the other sites, my advice would always be to check with Mercedes first to see whether they have the parts and whether they're in fact cheaper. Replacing all the hose clamps with stainless steel hose clamps from Accu. Now you can just about get away with a 10 to 12 mil one, but we'll be using 12 to 22. When you come to fit these hose clamps, it is important that you get the fittings facing the right way. For example, if you put that on that way, you would find that on the car you won't be able to tighten this up, so you need to spin that round. Now it is incredibly hard to line all of that up with any of those other rubber fittings on. So what I'm going to do is use a much longer bolt just to thread it first, and then put this bolt here in afterwards. Next up, I'm just going to wedge this bolt in here. These are stainless steel bolts, and just feel that hole, so hopefully that won't fall out because it's wedged in there with a little piece of tissue. Now that we've got that one in on that side, we can now take that long bolt out there and replace it with the proper one. Finally got all those hose clamps and the rubber bits on there, and boy did that take a while to do that. We're now going to fill this up with coolant and see if we've got any leaks. We're going to be using Prestone concentrate to fill this up. This is 4 litres of concentrated coolant, and we're going to mix it in a 2-to-1 ratio of deionized water. This here will cost you about £16.79 from Euro Car Parts, and this will cost you about £3.50 from Asda. It is worth mentioning that on the older cars with an older style coolant, the coolant loses its rust prohibitive qualities after a few years or a certain period of time. So if you haven't done a coolant flush for a while, you may well find that your engine and some of the pipes are also starting to rust, and the bottom of your engine potentially and bottom of your radiator has rusty sludge in it. So it's definitely worth doing a coolant flush if you haven't done one for a while. Now we're going to run the car, and the level of this will rise, and hopefully some of the air will come out. Well, we're going to have to adjust our idle speed up because, of course, with the new idle air valve in there, everything is going to need adjusting. What we should see is, as the temperature here starts to creep up, the revs over here will just drop down a little bit. It's the next morning, and we can see that our coolant level has dropped, so we just need to top that up and check for leaks. It's the next morning, and let's see if this car starts when it's cold. Okay, you can see that the revs on this this car are way too low, and they should be much higher and then drop down as the engine warms up. What we should be seeing is revs more like this when the car is cold. So what we need to do is rip out that auxiliary air slide valve and actually adjust the top of it up so that this is slightly more open. I noticed actually looking back at previous videos, on the one we fitted, that gap was about half of the gap of this one that we took off the car. I'm going to leave this video here. We'll sort out the auxiliary air valve off camera. Still to come on this car is all of the underneath of the car, the suspension, the exhaust. So what we'll do when we get rid of our gold parts car is swap these two cars around, get this up on the ramp. It'll be slightly easier to work on. And then on our silver AMG, which is running beautifully at the moment, the one thing we do need to do is replace all the rubber boots, the suspension boots on that car before the suspension struts start getting dust in them. So we'll be doing that in a future video.